The house sat at the end of a secluded lane, nestled among gnarled trees that creaked with every gust of winter wind. Harper had just moved in, a solitary retreat she needed after a breakup and a burnout at work. The real estate agent had warned her about the isolation, but that was precisely what Harper craved. Silence, peace, and distance from the world. That night, as snow blanketed the world outside, Harper curled up with a book, savoring the stillness. But the stillness wasn't absolute. There were little sounds, settling wood, the groan of pipes in the old walls, and something else, a faint scrape. She told herself it was the wind brushing a branch against the siding. Hours passed. Harper decided to head to bed, brushing her teeth and making a mental note to check the loose window pane in the morning. But when she entered her bedroom, the breath froze in her chest. The window was already ajar, just slightly, but enough to let the cold seep in. She hadn't opened it. She was sure of that. Her pulse quickened. Swallowing her nerves, she locked the window and scanned the room. Everything seemed untouched. "You're just tired," she whispered to herself, crawling under the covers. But sleep didn't come easily. The house didn't feel empty anymore. She was drifting in and out when she heard the faintest creak from the floorboards downstairs. Her heart pounded. She strained her ears, convincing herself it was the house settling again. Then came another sound, the deliberate click of a door being shut. Panic surged. Harper slid out of bed and grabbed her phone. She wanted to call someone. Anyone. But who? She hadn't made friends in the area yet, and her nearest neighbor was miles away. Clutching her phone like a lifeline, she crept to the top of the staircase. The house was silent again, but her instincts screamed otherwise. Each step down felt like a plunge into the abyss. She peeked around the corner into the living room. Nothing. Everything was in place. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Harper considered bolting out of the house, but where would she go? The snowstorm outside was relentless. She decided to check the doors, ensuring they were locked. As she reached the front door, she froze. The deadbolt was undone. She was meticulous about locking up. She knew she had locked it. Her trembling fingers slid the bolt back into place, but as she turned to check the rest of the house, the faint sound of breathing stopped her cold. It was soft, steady, and unmistakably closest. Her eyes darted toward the coat closet near the door. The breath was coming from inside. Every instinct told her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, she backed away toward the kitchen, where a knife block sat on the counter. Her hands were clammy as she gripped the largest blade. She held her breath, straining to hear any sound beyond the pounding of her heart. The closet door creaked open. "Who's there?" Harper's voice trembled as she brandished the knife, her back pressed against the counter. Silence answered. Then came the faintest chuckle, a sound so low and chilling it felt like ice sliding down her spine. A shadow moved in the dim light. A figure stepped forward, the gleam of snow boots visible beneath a long coat. The stranger's face was obscured by a scarf and hood, but the glint of eyes locked onto hers. "What do you want?" Harper demanded, her voice rising in panic. The figure tilted their head as if studying her. Then, without a word, they lunged. Harper screamed, slashing wildly. The knife connected once, then twice, before her attacker grabbed her wrist in a vice-like grip. She fought, kicked, bit, anything to get free. The knife clattered to the floor as she was shoved against the counter. In a desperate move, she grabbed the kettle from the stove and swung it with all her strength. The attacker staggered, giving her just enough time to sprint toward the door. Her shaking hands fumbled with the lock, and she threw it open, running barefoot into the freezing night. She didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the cold stabbed at her lungs and her feet burned in the snow. She ran until she saw headlights, an approaching car on the distant road. She waved frantically, collapsing as the vehicle skidded to a halt. The driver, a middle-aged man, helped her into the truck and called the police. Harper shivered uncontrollably, recounting the nightmarish events between sobs. When the police arrived and searched the house, they found no one. Just traces of blood, likely her attackers, leading out the back door and vanishing into the woods. They never caught him. Harper never returned to the house. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting.
Story number 2.
The town of Grinwood had a story, a legend whispered in hushed tones around campfires and at kitchen tables. Everyone knew about the house on Hollow Creek Road, but no one dared go near it after dark. Except for Lucas. Lucas wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghost stories. He was a skeptic, a self-proclaimed debunker of superstitions. So, when his friends dared him to spend the night in the Hollow Creek house, he laughed. "Easy," he said, his bravado masking a flicker of unease. The house had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its porch sagging under the weight of decay. It stood like a skeletal sentinel, cloaked in ivy and shadows. Lucas approached it, armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and his phone to record the experience. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and thick with the scent of rot. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight, illuminating cobwebbed corners and sagging furniture. The floor groaned under his weight as he explored, narrating his findings to the camera. "See? Just an old house," he muttered, his voice echoing back in a way that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He set up camp in the living room, spreading his sleeping bag on the floor and settling in with a smirk. He wasn't going to let a bunch of creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper scare him. But then, the first sound came. It was faint, a soft tap, tap, tap from upstairs. Lucas froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Probably just an animal," he said aloud, though his voice lacked conviction. He shined the beam toward the staircase, but saw nothing. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pacing. It grew louder, descending the stairs with slow, measured steps. Lucas's breath hitched. The beam of his flashlight wavered as it settled on the staircase. Nothing. He exhaled shakily and turned back to his sleeping bag, trying to laugh it off. The sound stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then a whisper. "Lucas?" His blood ran cold. The voice was low, guttural, and unmistakably real. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. He swung the flashlight wildly, its beam slicing through the dark. No answer. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, his breath visible in the dim light. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against him like a living thing. Lucas scrambled to his feet, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "All right, joke's over," he said, his voice trembling. "Whoever you are, come out." The whisper came again, this time from behind him. "Lucas?" He spun around, but there was no one there. Just the gaping blackness of the house, stretching endlessly. His heart thundered in his chest as a slow, creaking sound began behind him. He turned, and his flashlight illuminated the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, back and forth, though no one sat in it. Lucas felt the walls closing in, his skin prickling with terror. "I'm leaving," he muttered, backing toward the door. "This isn't funny." He stumbled into the hallway, his flashlight beam bouncing on walls. The shadows seemed to ripple and writhe as if alive. Then he heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following him. Lucas bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled and yanked, but it was as if the house itself had decided he wasn't leaving. Panic overtook him, and he began to pound on the door, screaming for help. Behind him, the footsteps grew louder, closer. He turned, his flashlight flickering. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by darkness. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its arms hung limply at its sides. "Lucas," the voice rasped, its lips unmoving. Lucas dropped the flashlight, plunging the hall into near-total darkness. He fumbled for his phone, trying to call for help, but the screen stayed black, the battery inexplicably dead. The figure began to move, its steps unnaturally jerky, like a puppet on strings. Lucas screamed, backing into the door as it drew closer. "Stay away," he shrieked. "What do you want?" The figure paused, its head tilting the other way. Then, in a voice that was many voices, it whispered, "You." The last thing Lucas saw was its face, or what was left of it, a twisted, hollow visage with empty eye sockets and a grin too wide for any human mouth. When Lucas's friends returned the next morning, they found the house silent and still. His sleeping bag was untouched, his flashlight lying on the floor, flickering weakly. But Lucas was gone. All they found was a single word, scratched into the wood of the living room floor, deep and jagged as if made by claws.
Story number 3.
The sun had long set over the isolated forest road when Kara's car sputtered, coughed, and died. She groaned, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. Her phone battery was low, and the nearest sign of civilization was miles back. The trees loomed like silent witnesses, their skeletal branches clawing at the dark sky. She decided to get out and check the engine. The cold bit at her exposed hands as she popped the hood and fumbled with her phone's flashlight. A broken belt, maybe? She had no idea. Kara cursed herself for not keeping a charger in the car. Then she heard it. a faint crunch of leaves behind her, deliberate and slow. Her heart skipped a beat as she froze, holding her breath. She turned her head just enough to glance over her shoulder. The road was empty, the trees still. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound firm. No answer. She shook her head and muttered, "It's nothing," but her pulse quickened. Quickly, she climbed back into the car, locking the doors. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. The forest felt alive, as if it were breathing around her. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of her vision, though the headlights barely illuminated a few feet ahead. Kara told herself to stay calm. Someone would drive by. She'd just have to wait. An hour passed. The road remained empty. The silence pressed in on her like a physical weight. Her phone buzzed, a single notification before the screen went dark completely. Shh. Low battery warning, 1 sec. She nearly jumped out of her seat when a knock came at the window. Her scream caught in her throat. A man stood outside, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes looked worn, and he carried a lantern that cast eerie flickers of light. "Need some help, miss?" His voice was gruff but calm, almost too calm. Kara hesitated. Every instinct told her not to trust him, but what choice did she have? She cracked the window slightly. "Yeah, my car broke down." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her face a little too long. "I've got tools in my truck. Parked just up the road? Want me to take a look?" She swallowed hard. "No, it's fine. I already called for help. They're on their way." The man tilted his head, his mouth curling into a faint smile. "No one comes out this far, miss. Not at this hour." Her skin crawled. "I'll wait," she said firmly, her voice cracking slightly. He nodded again, this time slower, almost as if savoring the tension in the air. "Suit yourself," he said, stepping back and vanishing into the darkness. The forest grew impossibly quiet after that. No rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls, just the oppressive stillness of the night. Kara's grip on the steering wheel tightened until her knuckles turned white. She jumped when something tapped against her back window. Turning, she saw nothing. The back seat was empty, and the glass reflected only her terrified face. Then the tap came again, from the passenger side window this time. She whipped her head around. Her breath hitched when she saw a handprint smeared across the glass, fresh, glistening. Her head spun. Had the man come back? Or had someone else been out there all along? Suddenly the car shook. A single, violent jolt, as if something heavy had dropped onto the roof. Kara screamed, fumbling for anything to protect herself. She grabbed her flashlight and pointed it out the window, scanning the trees. Nothing. The car shook again. The sound of scraping metal made her blood run cold. It was coming from above. She tried to open the door, but something outside slammed it shut. Kara was trapped. Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the flashlight like a weapon. The roof began to creak, buckling inward slightly, as if something massive was pressing down. The sound was guttural, low, guttural breaths mingled with a wet, dragging noise. Desperate, Kara honked the horn repeatedly, praying for someone, anyone, to hear. The noise stopped. For a fleeting moment, the night was still again. Then came the voice. Low and rasping, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Run!" The roof dented further, nearly caving in. Kara scrambled for the other door, unlocking it with trembling fingers and spilling out onto the icy asphalt. She ran blindly into the woods, branches tearing at her clothes and skin. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching infinitely into the void. Behind her, the sound of pursuit was unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching leaves, snapping twigs. A voice whispered her name, closer with every step. "Kara! Kara!" Her lungs burned as she stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated shack, its windows glowing faintly. She hesitated, but the footsteps were nearly upon her. Without thinking, she bolted inside and slammed the door shut. The shack was cold, reeking of mildew and decay. The faint glow came from a single lantern on the floor. As her breathing slowed, she realized she wasn't alone. In the corner, a figure sat hunched, its back to her. It rocked slightly, muttering words she couldn't make out. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure froze. Slowly, it turned its head, revealing hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Its mouth twisted into a too-wide grin as it rasped, "You shouldn't have come here." The last thing Kara saw was the lantern flickering out, plunging her into darkness as something cold and skeletal gripped her arm.
Story number 4.
In the small town of Ravenswood, there was a peculiar house on the edge of the cemetery that no one dared approach. Its shutters hung crooked, its paint peeled like old skin. and the trees around it grew in twisted shapes that seemed unnatural. They called it the mourner's house because of the endless sobbing that residents swore came from within, especially on nights when the fog rolled in thick and heavy. Emma didn't believe in haunted houses. A university student with a penchant for urban exploration, she thought of the house as the perfect subject for her latest blog post. Her friends begged her not to go, warning her about the stories of people who entered but never came back the same, or didn't come back at all. But Emma was stubborn. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and her notebook, she made her way to the house on a cold, moonless night. The cemetery was eerily silent as she approached, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The house loomed in the darkness, more decrepit up close than she'd expected. Its door was slightly ajar, as if waiting. Emma hesitated but pushed it open, the hinges screaming in protest. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. Her flashlight's beam danced across the foyer, revealing dusty furniture, peeling wallpaper, and an ominous staircase leading to the second floor. "This isn't so bad," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. She began snapping photos, her camera's flash illuminating the gloom. The house seemed ordinary. Abandoned, yes, but not haunted. Then she heard it. A soft, muffled sob coming from upstairs. Emma froze, her blood turning to ice. She told herself it was just the wind, the way it sometimes played tricks on the ears. But the sobbing grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of a woman in anguish, weeping as if her heart had been shattered. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity was stronger. She gripped her flashlight and camera tightly, ascending the creaking stairs. Each step felt like a leap into the unknown. The sobbing guided her to a door at the end of the hallway, barely hanging on its hinges. Emma swallowed hard and pushed it open. Inside was a small bedroom. A rocking chair sat in the center, facing away from the door. It moved ever so slightly, back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. A music box rested on a nearby dresser, its lid ajar. The melody it played was warped and disjointed like a broken lullaby. Emma's flashlight flickered. She cursed under her breath, smacking it against her palm. When the light steadied, her eyes locked onto the mirror above the dresser. A woman stood behind her reflection. Emma whipped around, but no one was there. The air grew colder, her breath now visible in the beam of the flashlight. The sobbing had stopped. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over her pounding heart. The rocking chair creaked. Slowly it began to turn, revealing an emaciated figure wrapped in a tattered shawl. The woman's face was hollow, her eyes black voids that seemed to absorb the light. She grinned, her teeth jagged and yellow, as she reached out a skeletal hand. "You came," the woman rasped, her voice like dead leaves crunching underfoot. Emma stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. She scrambled to pick it up, but when she looked up, the room was empty. The chair was still. The music box was silent. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, and this time she listened. She bolted down the stairs, her camera banging against her side, and ran out the front door into the icy night. But something was wrong. The cemetery looked different. The gravestones were older, weathered to the point of illegibility. The trees were taller, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. The town's lights, once visible in the distance, were gone. Emma spun in circles, panic rising like bile in her throat. The house's door slammed shut behind her, and for the first time, she realized she couldn't hear anything. Not the wind, not her breathing, not even the pounding of her own heart. Then she saw them. Figures began to emerge from the mist, their outlines barely visible but undeniably human. They moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching as if controlled by unseen strings. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, fixed on her. Emma turned and ran, but the ground felt wrong, soft and sinking under her boots like wet clay. The figures drew closer, their whispers filling the silence. "You shouldn't have come." She tripped, falling hard onto the frozen ground. Her camera skittered away, its lens cracking. She crawled toward it, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, when a hand, cold, bony, and unrelenting, clamped down on her shoulder. The last thing Emma saw before the world went black was the house, its windows glowing faintly, and the rocking chair moving on its own, as if mocking her. Days later, her friends found her camera near the edge of the cemetery, its memory card intact. The photos started off normal, empty rooms, broken furniture. But the final image was different. It showed Emma, her face pale and lifeless, sitting in the rocking chair, her eyes black voids, and her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. And behind her, the woman loomed, grinning back.
Story number 5.
The fog was thick the night Danny took the shortcut through Willow Creek Woods. He hated driving through there. It was a labyrinth of unmarked dirt roads surrounded by towering ancient trees. But he was running late for his night shift at the diner and didn't have a choice. The woods had a reputation. People whispered about strange disappearances and ghostly lights that lured travelers off the path. Danny dismissed it as nonsense, though the dense, suffocating darkness always gave him the creeps. He turned onto the gravel road, the headlights barely cutting through the mist. The sound of crunching gravel under his tires was the only noise. He adjusted the radio to drown out his unease, but all he got was static. With a sigh, he turned it off, leaving the hum of the engine as his sole companion. A shadow darted across the road. Danny slammed the brakes, his heart racing. The car skidded to a stop, its headlights illuminating nothing but trees and fog. He scanned the road, expecting to see a deer or a raccoon. Nothing. Probably just my imagination, he muttered, though his hands gripped the wheel tightly. He eased the car forward, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. The trees seemed to close in, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers. The fog grew thicker, swallowing the road. Danny slowed to a crawl, squinting to see beyond the hood of his car. Then his headlights caught it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Danny's breath caught in his throat. It was a woman, pale and barefoot, her white dress flowing like smoke around her. She stood motionless, her head tilted downward, dark hair obscuring her face. He honked the horn, but she didn't move. "Hey, you okay?" Danny called out, rolling down his window slightly. His voice felt small against the oppressive silence. The woman remained still, her head tilting ever so slightly to the side. A chill ran down his spine. Something about her was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but every instinct screamed at him to drive. "Sorry, lady," he muttered, shifting into reverse. The moment his car moved, the woman's head snapped up and Danny's stomach dropped. Her face was blank. No eyes, no nose, just smooth, featureless skin. She started walking toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Danny slammed the accelerator, reversing blindly. The car jolted as it hit something. A tree, maybe, but he didn't stop. The woman's pace quickened, her faceless head jerking unnaturally with each step. "Leave me alone," he screamed, his voice cracking. He shifted into drive and floored it, swerving around her. For a moment he thought he was safe, the figure disappearing into the fog behind him. Then she appeared in his rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat. Danny screamed, the car veering off the road and into the trees. The impact was sudden and brutal, the airbag deploying with a deafening pop. Dazed and bleeding from his forehead, he fumbled to open the door. The woman was gone. He staggered out, clutching his side, and leaned against the crumpled hood of his car. His breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned the woods, the fog swirling like a living thing. The silence was deafening. And then he heard it, a soft, wet whisper. "Danny!" His name slithered through the air, spoken by multiple voices at once, some high, some low, all wrong. He spun around, his vision swimming. Shadows moved within the fog, shapes barely visible but unmistakably human. "Danny!" The voices called again, closer this time. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the frozen ground. His phone, he reached into his pocket, pulling it out with shaking hands. No signal. The flashlight flickered to life, casting weak beams into the mist. The figures emerged, dozens of them, their faceless heads cocked at odd angles. They moved as one, jerking forward with every whispered call of his name. Danny scrambled to his feet and ran, plunging into the woods. Branches tore at his skin, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Danny, stay with us." His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest. But he didn't stop. He burst into a clearing, falling to his knees. The fog parted, revealing an old, crumbling well in the center of the space. The whispers stopped. For a brief, blessed moment, there was silence. Then a hand, cold and wet, gripped his ankle. Danny looked down, his scream catching in his throat. The woman was there, clawing her way out of the earth, her featureless face inches from his. "You're ours now," she rasped, her blank face splitting into a grotesque, toothy grin. The last thing Danny saw was the well, its dark depths yawning wide as the hands dragged him down. The next morning, the sheriff found Danny's car abandoned on the edge of the woods. The driver's seat was empty, but the windows were fogged over from the inside, each one etched with a single word, written in long, jagged letters. Stay.
Story number 6.
The air in the old library was heavy with the scent of aged paper and mildew. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, its dim lighting casting long, flickering shadows across the endless rows of books. Nobody visited the Ravensworth Library after dark, except for Meg. Meg had been the library's night custodian for 3 months. The job paid well, but the nights were long and lonely. Still, she liked the quiet. It was better than dealing with the noisy chaos of her day job. The library had rules, though. Odd rules. The most important, never under any circumstances touch the book with no title. When Meg had asked about it during her orientation, the head librarian, Mrs. Wilcox, had avoided eye contact. It's just old. Fragile. Leave it be, she'd said curtly. But Meg had seen the book. It sat on a pedestal in the restricted section, its black cover weathered and unmarked. Something about it felt off. Tonight, the library was darker than usual, the storm outside knocking out half the lights. Meg's flashlight cast a shaky glow as she made her rounds. She walked past towering shelves, her footsteps echoing eerily. Her route took her near the restricted section, where the door hung slightly ajar. Meg hesitated. That door was always locked. Curiosity prickled her skin. She stepped closer, peering inside. The room felt colder, the air sharp and metallic. Her flashlight swept over the familiar pedestal and stopped. The book was gone. Meg's heart skipped a beat. She stepped fully into the room, shining the light around. There was no sign of the book or any disturbance. The room was as still as a tomb. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor, a faint trail of smudged, dark stains leading out of the room and down the hallway. Footprints. Bare, human footprints. Her breath quickened. Maybe it was a prank. Some idiot sneaking in to mess with her. But the library was locked tight, and she'd checked every door at the start of her shift. She followed the trail, her footsteps tentative. The footprints led to the main reading room, where the enormous bay windows rattled in the storm's wind. The room was empty, the chairs neatly tucked in, except for one. At the center of the room, a figure sat hunched over, their back to her. Meg froze, her flashlight trembling. "Hello?" "The library is closed," she called out, her voice wavering. The figure didn't move. Her grip tightened on the flashlight as she approached. "You're not supposed to be here. I need you to..." The figure turned, and Meg's words died in her throat. It was a man, or what was left of one. His face was pallid, his eyes sunken and ringed with black, like deep, endless voids. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. In his hands, he cradled the book, its black cover pulsing faintly, as if alive. "You shouldn't have followed," he whispered, his voice low and rasping, as though it were made of crumbling stone. Meg stumbled back, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The man stood, impossibly tall, his limbs stretching unnaturally. The book in his hands opened on its own, its pages flipping violently as an invisible wind tore through the room. A sound, low and guttural, filled the space. It wasn't the wind or the storm. It was coming from the book. "Stop!" Meg screamed, her voice swallowed by the growing roar. She turned to run, but the library wasn't the same. The shelves loomed like walls of a labyrinth, the exits lost in a maze that hadn't existed before. Behind her, the man, or the thing wearing his form, began to hum a slow, tuneless melody. The sound grew louder, vibrating through her chest and filling her head. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The air around her seemed to shift, the books shaking on their shelves. Words began spilling from the pages, glowing faintly as they drifted into the air like ash. They swirled around her, forming ghostly, indecipherable shapes. She screamed again, but her voice was drowned by the sound of laughter, low, cold, and echoing. The man was closer now, his grin splitting his face as he held the book out toward her. "Read," he whispered. The book's pages turned to face her, and her eyes were drawn to the strange, writhing symbols scrawled across the parchment. She couldn't look away, her vision blurring as the symbols seemed to etch themselves into her mind. Her body froze, rooted to the spot. "Stop. Please," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. The book pulsed again, and everything went black. When Mrs. Wilkes arrived the next morning, she found the library eerily quiet, the air thick with a strange, metallic tang. Meg's cleaning cart was abandoned in the main reading room, but there was no sign of her. The book was back on its pedestal, closed and untouched, as if it had never moved. But something was different. A faint, ghostly whisper now filled the library, repeating the same phrase over and over. Don't open it. Don't open it.
Story number 7.
The town of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in mystery, its history marred by stories of disappearances and strange happenings. At the heart of the town stood the Ashburn Hotel, abandoned for decades, its once grand facade now a crumbling monument to forgotten times. The locals avoided it, warning of the curse that lingered within its walls. Amelia didn't believe in curses. A budding filmmaker, she saw the Ashburn as the perfect setting for her next project. She convinced her crew, her best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Ethan, and her younger brother Tyler to spend the night in the hotel. They were hesitant, but eventually agreed, lured by Amelia's enthusiasm and promises of viral success. The four arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The hotel loomed against the twilight sky, its broken windows staring like empty sockets. A rusted chain blocked the front entrance, but Ethan easily cut through it with a pair of bolt cutters. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The grand lobby was a shadow of its former self. Dust-coated chandeliers hung precariously, and the once polished marble floors were cracked and grimy. Creepy, Tyler muttered, his voice echoing. This better be worth it. Amelia ignored him, setting up her camera. It's perfect. Let's start with the lobby and work our way up. As they explored, the eerie atmosphere began to gnaw at their nerves. Shadows seemed to shift at the edges of their vision, and the air grew colder with every step. Sarah joked that the hotel was watching them, but no one laughed. They reached the ballroom, its vaulted ceiling adorned with peeling murals. In the center of the room stood an old upright piano, its keys yellowed and warped. Tyler couldn't resist and struck a chord. The sound was off, discordant and hollow, as though the piano were playing from underwater. Don't, Amelia snapped, a note of unease creeping into her voice. They decided to split up to cover more ground. Amelia and Ethan took the upper floors, while Sarah and Tyler explored the basement. They agreed to meet back in the lobby in an hour. Amelia and Ethan climbed the grand staircase, the wooden steps groaning under their weight. The second floor was lined with guest rooms, each door hanging ajar. They peered into one room after another, finding only decaying furniture and tattered curtains. Check this out, Ethan said, stepping into a room at the end of the hall. Amelia followed, her camera rolling. The room was in slightly better condition than the others, its bed still intact, though the sheets were yellowed with age. On the nightstand was a single photograph, its edges curling with age. It depicted a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling brightly. Amelia frowned. Something about their faces seemed wrong. The eyes. They were too wide, their pupils too dark. Ethan leaned closer to examine it, but Amelia grabbed his arm. Let's keep moving. As they left the room, a faint sound reached their ears, a slow, deliberate tapping like footsteps. Tyler, Ethan called out, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping stopped. Meanwhile, in the basement, Sarah and Tyler found themselves in a labyrinth of dark corridors. The air was damp and smelled of rot. They discovered an old boiler room, its machinery rusted and silent. Let's go back, Tyler said, his voice trembling. This place gives me the creeps. Sarah rolled her eyes but agreed. As they turned to leave, a low whisper echoed through the room. Stay, Tyler froze. Did you hear that? Sarah nodded, her face pale. They shone their flashlights wildly, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time. Stay with us. They bolted, their footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. The corridors twisted and turned, and soon they realized they were lost. Amelia, Tyler shouted, his voice cracking. The lights flickered, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Sarah tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When Tyler turned to help her, his flashlight caught a glimpse of something, no, someone, standing at the end of the corridor. It was the little girl from the photograph. Her head tilted unnaturally, her wide, unblinking eyes fixed on them. A smile stretched across her face, too wide for her small features. Run, Tyler screamed, pulling Sarah to her feet. Back upstairs, Amelia and Ethan reached the third floor. The tapping had returned, louder and more deliberate. The hallway stretched unnaturally, seeming longer than before. At the far end, a door stood slightly open, flickering light spilling out. We shouldn't go in there, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. We have to, Amelia insisted, though her hands shook as she adjusted the camera. They approached the door, the air growing heavier with each step. Inside was a parlor, eerily pristine compared to the rest of the hotel. A fire crackled in the fireplace, though no one was there to tend it. In the center of the room was a large mirror. It reflected the room perfectly, except for one thing. In the reflection, the room was full of people. Men and women in formal attire danced and laughed silently, their faces blurred and distorted. Amelia gasped as she saw herself and Ethan in the reflection. But they weren't standing. They were sitting in the corner, staring blankly ahead, their eyes black voids. "What the?" Ethan began, but the mirror shattered, the sound deafening. The fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. By the time Sarah and Tyler reached the lobby, Amelia and Ethan were nowhere to be found. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent. The front doors, once wide open, were now locked. Tyler banged on the glass, screaming for help. Behind them, the piano in the ballroom played a single haunting note. "Tyler," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. He turned to see what she was staring at. On the grand staircase stood Amelia and Ethan, their faces blank and expressionless. Their eyes were deep, black pits, and their mouths moved silently in unison. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single word, spoken in a deep, guttural voice. "Stay." The last thing Tyler saw before the darkness swallowed them was the little girl, her too wide smile stretching impossibly as she reached for him. The Ashburn Hotel remains abandoned, its doors chained shut. But on stormy nights, locals swear they can hear the faint sound of a piano echoing from within, accompanied by the soft, dissonant whispers of those who stayed.